Hello, everybody, and welcome to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreer. I am your host, Cale Zeldin, and we are here for second episode of season 3. Rod, how goes the fight, my friend? How goes the fight?
I got to tell you, it's weird. It seems like winter's never going to end. Although today I notice as we're talking, it's not as dark as it used to be. And it's actually a little bit warmer here in Budapest. I was talking with a Hungarian friend earlier today, and we had all been dreading this winter because, it's not going to be enough heating and all that. But climate change has been our friend this year. So
this is good. I mean, insofar as that's the case, right? It's saving you all from a potentially brutal situation. Although let's not count our chickens before they're hatched, Mr. Dreer.
Point.
It is still January. There are months ahead of us. So
Cale, you had talked to me earlier this year about how we need to talk about C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength when I finally finish it. Yep. Well, I'm about halfway through now, and I got to tell you, man, I keep underlining things in it, thinking this is us. This is where we are today. That Lewis was so unbelievably prophetic.
Amazing. He really is amazing. The book is oddly overlooked. I'm not entirely sure why. I have my sort of weird theories on it, but anyway, it's been basically ignored unless you're like a real like C.S. Lewis person, who's going to sort of do the deep dive stuff. The Narnia books are of course very popular, and I don't mean to say that a lot of people haven't read That Hideous Strength, but it seems to be a kind of second cut or a third cut if you're a Lewis fan. And I agree with you, Rod. I am blown away. I'm actually rereading it right now because you were reading it, and what I'm really struck by, and maybe I don't know if this resonates with you, is that Lewis seems to sort of make some kind of connection between the sort of scientific and technological advancements and some sort of deeper spiritual movement. And is that what you're getting?
Right. That's true. And I don't want to go too much into it because I haven't finished it and I don't want to mislead our listeners. But Lewis sees that there's with the growing attempt to control the world using technology and the cult of expertise, Lewis sees a darker spiritual meaning to that. And, if you were a reader of Paul Kingsnorth's writings about the machine and things like that, then to read C.S. Lewis's novel from, 60, 70 years ago, it's like reading today's news.
No, it's true. And I wonder what you think about this. And I know you're midway through, so I don't want to spoil it. But just like we've got a second here. What do you think about it in relationship to McGhilchrist's work?
Well, Iain McGhilchrist talks in his great book, The Matter with Things. It's a book about metaphysics, which makes it sound dead boring, and it's really not. Right. Because what Iain McGhilchrist is talking about is what is reality anyway? Right. How can we reliably know reality, what reality is? And if so, how? And one thing McGhilchrist says, and this is actually a nice segue into what we're going to talk about today.
Good. Great.
McGhilchrist talks about how to be modern is to seek to control everything and to think you can know everything to control it. Because that's what the left brain does. To oversimplify his theory, he says, we know from neuroscience that the functions of the brain of abstract reasoning, of breaking things down to analyze them, happens in the left hemisphere, but the taking in of raw data, sense data, and intuition, empathy, things like that happen in the right hemisphere. Mm-hmm. He says that we in the West, since at least the scientific revolution, have been privileging the left hemisphere way of knowing because it has given us so much power over the material world and allowed us to control it. But, says McGhilchrist, this has come at a huge price because we are not connected to reality. In fact, we're becoming more and more disconnected from the real world, while at the same time telling ourselves that, as science marches on, we're learning more and more and more about the nature of reality. This is a fundamental illusion, he says, and we're going to wreck ourselves if we don't turn back.
Yeah, and what strikes me about that, about his work, Rod, something you've been hitting on is this: there's a trick that we are kind of playing with ourselves, that we are the left brain, so the left hemisphere, I should say, has can convince you that it is the sort of the totality of things, right? So that
Right.
it sort of starts playing the role of the right hemisphere, which is sort of the hemisphere of holistic
That
meaning,
integrates
and
everything. Yeah.
that integrates everything. And so it's sort of it is the left hemisphere disintegrates. That's where it derives its power from, but it convinces you that the disintegration is actually an integration.
Exactly.
And this kind of mind game that we see play out is as well as you said the other day, it's a kind of recipe for scaled out madness. And we're not talking about madness in the anger, the register of anger, but madness in the register of like crazy.
Yeah, one of the things McGhilchrist, who is a psychiatrist, notices is that we don't really have any records in history of schizophrenia until the modern era. He said you can go back and look at the records even from ancient Egypt, and we can see evidence of what we call now manic depression, bipolar disorder, and all that.
Yep.
Schizophrenia is a disease of modernity, and he suggests that so is autism.
Yeah.
Both of which have to do with left brain malfunction. So you would imagine a society that in which people raised in that society, a left brain dominant society, would be the sort of people who take as their default position that everything can ultimately be controlled. And when things feel like they're going out of control, people feel disconsolate, they feel anxious, they feel depressed, they feel resentful and paralyzed.
Yeah. You know what strikes me, Rod, as I'm hearing you say this out loud, there's a way in which you can kind of read philosophy, especially continental philosophy. You really from like Descartes on, I know sort of doing a low res, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying here, that you can kind of read the contributions of modern philosophy as a kind of over exercise of left hemispheric thinking, so, and I personally, read the life of like a Kant, for instance, or Descartes or any of these guys. And boy, it is really hard to read their biography in conjunction with their work and not get a feeling like, man, are they on the spectrum in some kind of interesting way? Yeah. And again, I don't want to be a jerk about this. I'm not trying to sort of just dismiss it, like as quote unquote, like mere autism or mere Asperger's or something like this. But there is something about that type of brain that we see played out in the history of philosophy, really from Descartes on, but also that the systems in which it creates affirm and select for that kind of analytical bias.
Precisely. This is one thing that I've noticed when I've tried to tell people about McGhilchrist's work. I say that McGhilchrist says that we are fundamentally misleading ourselves when we tell ourselves that the left brain way of knowing, i.e. science, mathematics, is superior. McGhilchrist says we need more of a balance. The right brain way of knowing has more to do with arts, with poetry, with music, with religion, and it's not just something, an add-on that makes life pleasant, but it is an epistemology, a way of knowing that is valid. And they look at you like you're crazy because we've all been raised in this culture to think that really science is the God. And if you really want to understand something, you better see what science has to say about it. McGhilchrist says that this is just a fundamental mistake. And I think he's right. One thing that I was rereading some of his stuff this week because I'm at that point in writing my own book about about what does McGhilchrist have to say to the Re-enchantment project.
Yep.
And it just really struck me. He was talking about how in the left brain culture and society like we live in now, people become alienated from their bodies. He said anorexia just didn't show up until the modern age. And I'm thinking, he doesn't even take into account transgenderism, gender dysphoria, because when he was writing this book, it really hadn't manifested, but that is so clear.
It's a clear manifestation of it. So I read at your suggestion, I read Master and His Emissary this past summer.
That's his first book, 2009.
Yeah. And of course I am I'm literally it's my next book on the queue. I have a bunch of papers to grade first, but next on my queue is The Matter with Things, the 2-volume piece that you've been talking about as well, his subsequent book. But so I read it explicitly in the context of this explosion of the trans ideology as a kind of social phenomena and contagion. And boy, it just really brings it all home. It's really difficult for me to see what we're all seeing online and elsewhere. Maybe that's an interesting distinction we can get to in just a minute. But it's really hard for me to see all of this and not think of McGhilchrist's work, because the left brain is so powerful that it can even convince itself that the reality it thinks it's seeing is not the fullness of reality.
That's right.
That's right. Potent, Rod.
That it really is. And, again, this is all going into my book, but there's a German sociologist named Hartmut Rosa, R-O-S-A. Yep. And Rosa has a concept called resonance. And I think that's a synonym for enchantment. What he means, yeah. He's not writing from a religious perspective at all, but he says that when we feel resonance with the world beyond our heads, we feel at home in the world. We feel that there's some connection between us and the outside world, whether it's people, whether it's the river, things like that. Yeah. He says that, but we, in modernity, this is Rosa, have set ourselves up to disenchant, or maybe you could say de-resonate the world in this way. He says there's a 4-step process to doing this, and it's all about control. He said, first of all, we identify something we want to know, a phenomenon. Second, we establish some sort of relationship with it. Third, we try to fully encompass it with our minds. And when that happens, fourth, the mystery, the thing that made us be attracted to it in the first place goes away. It becomes a dead thing to us, right?
Yes, it's dead. Yeah. And even a cat knows that the mouse that's dead is no fun to play with.
Oh, well said. Well said.
Right.
Well, that brings us to the thing that you and I really want to talk about today, because it totally plays into this. I got I put something on my blog in the past few days. I had seen something on Twitter where a college professor said that she taught Robert Nozick's experience machine to her class and asked how many would want to plug into it. And all but one said they would. And this shocked her. Robert Nozick's experience machine is a thought experiment that the well-known 20th century philosopher, Harvard philosopher, Robert Nozick came up with. He said simply this: imagine there was a machine that you could plug into, and it would give you an experience of something really, really fun and exhilarating and pleasant. You wouldn't really be having it, but you wouldn't know that. It would tell your mind that this was reality. Would you want to be plugged into this? And what it basically amounts to is the Matrix. Would you want to be?
What is that, Roger? I bet people don't remember that movie. It's been a long time.
Oh my God, The Matrix. Yeah. Well, it's a 1990s movie in which, this is where we get the term red pill, where, is it Lawrence Fishburne?
It is. Yeah, it is.
Morpheus is his name. He holds out to young Keanu Reeves 2 pills. He said, He said, if you take the blue pill, you'll go back to normal life. Everything will be just as you knew it. But if you take the red pill, then you will see that you have been living in a simulation, and you'll see what reality really is and can deal with that. Which do you want? And of course, he takes the red pill and sees reality, that everybody lives in a simulation that makes him think that everything is okay. And he joins this sort of rebellion against the falseness of it. Okay. Right. Well, so I posted onto my blog this thing about the experience machine, saying, would you want to be part of it? Why not? Why not? I got this really interesting email from a young woman in her late 20s who is an Orthodox Catholic, right? Raised in a Catholic home. Turns out I know her parents, raised in a very solid Catholic home, who said, "Oh yeah, I would do it easily. And if I didn't do it, it would require all of the strength of my upbringing and my faith to resist it." I said, "Well, why is that?" Well, and she went on to talk about how anxiety-filled her life is, how and her generation's life. She said, "We don't have job security, prospect of marriage is difficult, and on and on and on and on." And so she gave me permission to post her long letter about that. And I got some really interesting responses from some people who were really sympathetic, others who were not sympathetic at all, who pointed out that her problem is, and she admits this in the letter, that she has spent a whole lot of time online from her youth, playing video games, just living online. And a number of commenters said, "There's your problem right there. You think that reality is online," or and I don't know if any one of my commenters said it or whether I thought about this. Said if your reality is an online reality, then it shapes your perception without you even realizing what's happening into thinking that experience can be controlled.
Right.
And I think that I've noticed this in myself too. I've been working at home for the last 12 years. My primary conduit to the world every day is online. And that's how I make my living. And it's been great. But I've noticed that it's harder for me to have social interactions. It's almost like it has brought out a latent autism in me. I find that when the phone rings, I don't want to answer it. I'd really rather text with people. And that's weird. But I wasn't that way before, but I think that this constant exposure to online life and the controllability of online life makes me anxious when I go out into the world, which is not predictable. And this young woman's letter really brought all this to mind. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm struck, I'm struck by the phenomena of it. And I read it. I read your original post with her letter, and it was, I wouldn't say it's shocking exactly. I was grieved a little bit by her honesty, if that makes sense. In other words, she said, in order for me to not take the blue pill and go back to the experience machine, because that's sort of the way it sort of rolls out here, that it would require an extraordinary personal sacrifice of her affective reality. And so that struck me. Number two, I'm struck by people tend to be pretty dismissive of her honesty. And so that struck me. But I'm also struck, Rod, by the fact that you and I, both two grown men who do a lot of life online, right? You probably a little bit more so than me just because of my day job.
Yeah, you teach class.
Yeah, my job, right? In my job, I have to, quote unquote, I have to interact with people all the time. I mean, it's we joke here at a boarding school, it's a kind of a 24/7 type thing, because it kind of really is, and so I teach classes with the kids. I eat lunch with the kids. I go to dinner and they see me and my family at dinner, and then I'll do study hall, and then I'll drive the chaperone buses, and I coach them in the afternoons. I do all of these things. And so I'm constantly just sort of walking around, with my body amongst bodies, like in the field, like in the world, right? And it saves you from a kind of excessive mental mind cage kind of reality or irreality. But you and I have the additional good fortune that we have a memory of an analog existence. We lived in a world that was not plugged into the digital memeplex in the way that it certainly is now. And though you and I participate heavily in that kind of plugged in digital world, we have at least still a memory of walking to the store with, $1.75 in our pocket and completely disconnected and unmoored from our home base and to go buy a gallon of milk or what have you on our own as a kid who's 11 years old or whatever. Like, we have these kind of memories of a world that was not completely and totally digital and plugged in. And so for I think you and I may be tempted to be a little bit dismissive of your letter writer's despair.
Well, you say that, and I can remember as a kid growing up in the 70s. I bet your parents said this too. Like, my dad would always be honest, like, turn the TV off, go outside and play.
All the time, Rod.
Because
all the time.
There was something that our parents' generation believed, that sitting there passively in front of a screen was somehow harming you. And, I think they're right. But I hated it because I loved sitting there watching TV.
Right.
Well, our kids are in a world where the TV screen is so quaint. That's almost an analog thing.
No, now, they don't watch TV.
Yeah.
People our age and older who are either watching or listening have to understand that kids don't watch TV in any way that resembles what we did growing up.
Right. But, myself too, I went out yesterday here in Budapest. There's a bakery that makes really good bread, and I wanted to get. It's not nearby, so I went out, got on the tram, had to go up Bela Bartok Street, get off at the bakery, got my loaves, came back, stopped at a coffee shop to buy some beans and all that. But while I was on the tram, and this is only for maybe a 15-minute ride both ways, I was either on my phone or on my Kindle reading.
Right.
Because I was too anxious just to sit there and look at this beautiful city around me, or just be alone with my thoughts. And there's something really wrong with that. I hear the echo of my dad's voice saying, turn off the TV and go outside and play. But I tell myself that, wait a minute, I'm not, this isn't TV. Because if I'm on my phone, I'm checking Twitter, I'm writing emails and all that. Or if I'm on my Kindle, I'm at least reading a book.
Right.
It's still a screen, you know?
Yeah. I remember when I lived in a place where I was taking the subway every day to work. I first started. I would listen to things on my earphones, and after about 2 weeks, I had to stop doing it because I felt so alienated from myself and my surroundings. And so I started to I just brought a book with me. And so I would read in the subway, and it was a weird difference. And it doesn't seem like it would be that different, but it was when I'm reading a book in a subway, for whatever, 35 minutes or however long the ride was, like, I'm still in the world with the people around me, and I can kind of look down at the book but I'm hearing things, and I can, look up. It's a much more, it was an integrated experience, and it was not nearly as alienating as it was when I was either looking at my phone or listening with sort of both, noise canceling headphones on. It was an interesting experience.
Kel, I shared the young woman's letter with my son, Matt, who's 23 years old. And he was not sympathetic at all, which struck me. I found that really odd. But then I thought about how he basically said she needs to go outside and touch grass, which is a common response. And I thought about, though, how he had been raised in his childhood. I mean, Matt is very slightly on the autism spectrum, but he's also a really smart kid and didn't really fit in at school. So he spent a hell of a lot of time online. We figured that was the best we could do. But he read a lot of books too. But then he goes off to college, and he can't drive because he's got some whatever reasons he can't drive a car. So he gets on his bike, and he becomes an avid cyclist. And he gets involved with the college radio station, and he starts teaching himself how to make art, like different kinds of printing methods and things like that. So. And I noticed a total change in his personality, all for the better.
That's interesting.
He was so much more integrated with his body and with the world around him, and so much happier. But it took getting out of the house, not just sitting there, because we lived in a subdivision in Baton Rouge, right? He couldn't walk anywhere.
Exactly.
There was nowhere to walk to,
Right.
and
Right.
like most cities, Baton Rouge, American cities, Baton Rouge is not pedestrian friendly. And Matt told me he's moving over here next month to live with me in Budapest. He said one reason he's happy to be coming here is because he can't wait to be in a city where it's easy to bike and it's easy to walk around.
That's
Because
right.
he's learned to love the real world, the tactile world, the world that he spent much of his youth escaping from.
I've been thinking a lot about. There's a famous quip by Winston Churchill, and it is in the aftermath of the raids, right? The bombing of London, etc. And it's actually a couple of years after it, and so they're literally kind of surrounded by rubble. And he's making an argument that they need to rebuild, the houses. It wasn't the House of Parliament, but it was one of these major buildings, one of these gathering spaces. And he makes the line, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers have heard the line before, but something along the lines of, we make our buildings, and then afterwards our buildings make us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a real wisdom in that insight, and it is one that I think is larger than just a building, although the building certainly makes it. Now, if you can kind of scale that out, we have built our cities, and afterwards our cities have built us. We have built our internet, and afterwards our internet has built us. We have, and you can kind of keep playing this sort of game. And I think there's a real truth to it. And I think there's a McGhilchristian tie-in here, but I don't want to get into that too much. But the idea here is that we have constructed this world, and your young correspondent from an Orthodox Catholic family is responding to the fact that the world which has been created for her, and that she has been brought up in, is deeply, deeply unsatisfying and alienating. And I just urge our audience to not dismiss it. And again, I'm not jumping on Matt's case here, because I think he's probably right. Get outside, touch grass. I do think that there's an insight into that, but that's also a kind of a luxury belief, right? To use that kind of Rob Henderson notion that, it's easy for you to say, right? And I know that Matt is not a hopelessly disconnected elite, but you can understand. In other words, how do you just disconnect from the digital world, Rod? I mean, how could you just do this?
Yeah.
One of your correspondents said, early on in your thread, sorry, and I'll let you go here, but one of your correspondents said, I tried to get people to read Zubov's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and nobody wants to do it because they don't want to get rid of it. And again, I'm sympathetic to that, but what do you expect these young people to do? What do you expect you and I to do? We can't just suddenly just not be digital.
Well, I think it's not a false choice, though, because Matt is digital. He has to be. He lives in this world, but he had to make I don't want to speak for him, but I think I understand what he's saying. He said he had to. Necessity compelled him to take up cycling, and he discovered. What's that?
Carve out. In other words, you have to create carve outs in a world.
Right.
Otherwise, it'll dominate. The digital world will dominate you unless you carve out some space for non-digital time.
Right. And he was shocked and delighted to find that he loved cycling. Right. It made him feel so much better, and he just and this was a path that he wouldn't have taken otherwise, but necessity made him do it, and he's like, wow, this is great. And he loves music, and walked in freshman semester to the college radio station and asked for a job. And he enjoyed meeting people there, and on and on and on. But I think what he would say is that he had to make a decision not to leave the digital world behind, because that's really not possible today, but to not let it dominate him. And he had to make a conscious decision to step away from it. I can remember I lived with Matt and his roommate, another undergraduate, for about a month before I moved over to Budapest.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to me to observe these two guys, both the same age, 22, 23, around that age. And Matt was always coming and going, doing something at the radio station or this or that.
Yeah.
But his roommate, whenever he was in from class, had his head in his phone. I mean, and I remember thinking, I mean, this is a really smart kid. I'm thinking, how can you live that way? I mean, as much time as I spend online, if I was in college, dude, I would be out, all the time chasing girls and meeting people, doing things. But I suspect that Matt's roommate is a lot more like most kids than Matt is. And again, in Matt's case, this is something he had to learn on his own. I was thrilled. I got this text yesterday from Matt's younger brother, Lucas, who's about to turn 19. And he sent a picture of himself outside this beat up old Honda that he had been taking apart to rebuild it, because he's passionate about cars and has taught himself and been working with some older guys, mechanics, how to deal with cars. It delights me, because this is a kid. I mean, he's got a phone and all that, but he has fallen in love with the real world. Also, his younger sister, she's always loved baking, but during COVID, she got really good at it. And I mean, she can't possibly know this because these kids grew up when they did, but they don't know how different they are from most of their peers because they do things with their hands.
Yeah. No, it's really true. I think that, how about this as a tie-in, Rod? I think it hits at what you're getting at here. The idea of being of sort of cultural competencies. Now, that phrase has been co-opted by sort of the woke, that cultural competencies is sort of a cover for race critical thinking. But the idea that we as a culture come together and we build out a world, and it is basically competent. And one of the marvels of the first world, one of the marvels of the Western world, and the way in which that has been scaled out really to the entire globe now or thereabouts, is that it works. It is a massive, deep physical reality that works basically. And when it doesn't work, it becomes a kind of, a several day scandal, like the airlines, the last, over the holidays became a scandal because, these things we're no longer as competent as we once were to keep the buildings standing and the systems moving and the trains going and the planes landing and taking off. We're kind of losing that thread, right? And I think it's because what people don't understand, right? And maybe this is a generational thing. I can take out my phone right now and I can take out one of the apps and order something and have it come to me in about 45 minutes here on my side door, right? And it becomes really tempting to think that you can control the universe through the little black mirror that we're constantly using. Now, what the mindful person is going to remain conscious of is the fact that at the end of every one of these little apps, somebody literally took a hamburger patty out of the walk-in cooler and stuck it on the grill and made it and put a piece of cheese on it and stuck 2 pieces of bread on it. And then another person then goes and shows up physically and takes that little brown bag and fills it with fries and then brings it to my door. Right? It's not the app isn't at the end of it, there's a person, there's an incarnate reality underneath all of this sort of digital pseudo reality or para reality. And I think it must be very easy to forget that.
Well, look, it's funny you say that. I got this email this morning from a friend of mine. He's around my age. He was an engineering professor. Lost his job because he refused to get the COVID jab.
Yep.
And he left the big city and moved out to the countryside. And he ended up taking up, of all things, blacksmithing. He wanted something to do. He had money saved up, but he got into blacksmithing, and he absolutely loved it in the same way that Matt loves cycling. Yeah. This gave him something to do with his hands. It was creative, and on and on and on. He said he calls it realistic. He said, you can't screw up. I mean, because you've got hot molten metal and this and that, and anyway, he was telling me this morning that, and he's a big Paul Kingsnorth fan. He was telling me that he can see now that the guys he started out with in the engineering field who remained in it, he said their minds are different. They have come to think like the machine.
Wow.
He said they've definitely lost creativity. He said, I would even say they've lost some of their soul. He said, because in order to do the machine, to make the machines run, these are coders, engineers, things like that. You have to, you work in the machine world all day long, and it shapes how you think.
And what it also does, this is so good, Rod, because it also, it shape, you begin, and I've seen this with people, like you begin to more identify with the machines you tend to versus like a human being.
Yeah.
So, and boy, and people say this kind of thing, and it's always rather shocking to me because it's just not my bent, right? I'm not sympathetic to a machine in the way that, but some people get in this vein, don't they?
Mm-hmm. They do, and they begin to see the body as a machine. Right. You remember that book by Yuval Noah Harari called Homo Deus? Means,
of course.
Yeah. One of the big catchphrases from that book where he talks about how tech and science are going to make us like gods.
Yep.
Which is so Luciferian. But
what does that sound like, Roger?
Yeah.
Where does that? Yeah. Okay.
But he has this phrase in there: organism is algorithm.
Yeah.
Organism is algorithm, and what he says is all of life, all of biological life, can be reduced ultimately to an algorithm. We don't have it. We haven't identified it yet, but he's sure it's there. And once this happens, and we can plug into this is transhumanism, basically. Yeah. Then our lives will be so much better because the machine knows better what we're really like than we do. And I listened to him I read the book and I listened to him give a speech on that. I saw a clip recently, and it's nice. NICE. It's C.S. Lewis's world, where the planners, the experts, the scientists, the technologists, they love us and have a wonderful plan for our life, or rather they hate us. They hate humanity and have a wonderful plan for our lives. Right. But this, and I'm going somewhere with this.
Yeah, no, good. This is great.
You see, if young people who are raised on the internet, on the digital world, who are digital from the get-go, whose minds are framed that way, it is so easy for them to think of everything as bits and bytes,
right?
Even human flesh. And that's why I think so many of them have fallen prey to gender dysphoria and all that, because they think that they should be, that the body is just a technology.
Right.
And it has no intrinsic meaning, unlike what Christians believe. The body has no intrinsic meaning. We can fiddle with it as to make it conform to human will. Yeah. And this is, it's not true. It's not real. But we have, I fear, a long way to go before we learn this lesson. Final point.
Well, I feel like we're running headlong into it. I feel like voices like yours or mine are completely overwhelmed by the voices of the machine.
Yeah, because the machine owns us. And, I was thrown back too, thinking about the experience machine, into this thing I quoted all the time. It's in Live Not by Lies. My friend Anna here in Budapest, Catholic Anna, saying, she's like in her mid-30s now, saying that almost all of her friends, even her Catholic friends, can't deal with suffering in any way, shape, or form. And they consider something that is just, that would be considered by most older people an inconvenience. To them, that is intolerable suffering. And there's the famous story about her telling me this on a tram when I was in Budapest doing the research. And I said, it sounds like, Anna, that you yourself are fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's right. Where'd you get that? And I went to Brave New World. Yeah. Well, the experience machine is a lot like Brave New World.
That's right.
Where the system in Huxley's dystopia created a world in which you're constantly distracted, constantly, because of drugs and other things, given pleasure. the only thing you had to do is surrender your soul. And the only dissident in that world, John the Savage, is someone who has accepted suffering and imperfection as an inevitable part of what it means to be a human being.
Right. So two things on that. I think that what John the Savage recognizes, without really necessarily putting words to it, although he almost certainly does now that I think about it, he understands that this is precisely what poetry teaches us. Right? Poetry teaches us surprise and recognition, and the sort of the, it shows us holes, right? And John, of course, is like, I want Shakespeare. Explicitly, he's saying this, I want Shakespeare. I want suffering, because he knows that that is somehow connected to his enfleshed reality. In other words, I think, Rod, what we're talking about here is soul, okay? And you were talking about your engineering friend, and he left the academy and is a blacksmith now. And I love, this is great, because I think about, like, what does the craft of being a blacksmith teach you? And of course, I'm going to go here, but this is, of course, Crawford's shop class is soulcraft, right? And I think about this, like, so when you're working hot molten iron and you're beating it into form or shaping it or doing whatever it is you're doing, like, you're living on the edge of catastrophe. And there's no script per se that will deal with the hyper particularity of this molten blob of iron that you're wringing into shape, right? And so what worked on Tuesday is going to be slightly different that works on Thursday because of the differences of the particular. Right. And so when you're shaping this, let's say you're making a nail, or you're making, a horseshoe or whatever it is, like you are on the edge of, like, a little bit on the left, a little bit on the right. Like you're actively engaged, you're embodiedly engaged, or something like that, engaged with the work. And the work itself, like, has a very specific telos. Like, that if you make this mistake, then it's not going to fit on the horse, let's say, something like that, right? And so part of the allure of that work is that you can actually mess up, right? And that the mess up is you get that kind of incarnate feedback that I think you don't get in the sort of the knowledge worker world. Right. In knowledge worker world, it's a spreadsheet. We're dealing with bytes and bits and data, et cetera. So being in that moment of trying to make something real, right? Because that's what the blacksmith is doing. He's making something real out of kind of raw material. There's no I don't know. It's so deeply participatory that you're not allowed to kind of just float off in your head somewhere.
It's interesting you say that. I listen to you talk. I was reminded how the only hobby I have, the only thing I do besides writing, is cooking.
Yeah,
I love cooking, and
I was thinking of this too, Rod, because I do as well.
Cooking gives me a satisfaction that I can't get from writing. I mean, I love writing; it's what I do. Yeah, but I never really know if what I've written is any good. But with cooking, the proof is in the tasting. Yeah. And when I cook something, if it hits the mark, I know why it's hit the mark, because I put it together with my own hands. Yeah. And if it doesn't, I know why it doesn't. And it is for me, it's so much more satisfying than writing, even though writing is what I do. And you talk about Matthew Crawford, in the book that followed Shop Class of Soulcraft. It's called The World Beyond Your Head. I'm drawing on that for my Re-enchantment book. And he talks about organ making. There's a chapter on some old-fashioned pipe organ makers who live in rural Virginia. Yeah. And gosh, it's so fascinating. And he talks about how what they do, you just can't learn it by machine. It is a craft, and it is a craft that has to be taught from one person, a master to an apprentice. Right. And right. You can't have a YouTube tutorial on how to do this. And I think that if you do that kind of work, similar to the kind of work my younger son does on cars, you're connected to the world beyond your head in a way that you just aren't when all your work is on the screen. and it's let's go to church for a second.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I had a slight epiphany this week working on the Re-enchantment book. Um, I had thought about Re-enchantment as becoming more aware of the presence of the spiritual in the world. And I think that's a big part of it, because so much of contemporary religion, even in the more sacramental churches, which don't really teach this, but contemporary religion is a disembodied thing.
Yeah,
it's a set
totally.
of doctrines, manipulating doctrines, or it's a moral behavior, that sort of thing. We who come from the sacramental churches, Orthodoxy in my case, Catholicism in your case,
Yeah.
Our traditions know that that there needs to be, the body has to be involved in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I realized this week when I was working on a chapter and thinking about it, why the Pentecostals, charismatics, why even though they are admirably more aware of the presence of spirit, the spirit world around us, I can't really look to them as an example of re-enchantment, because as Protestants, they are so separated from the body. And when I went into this book, I thought I would be able to cite the Pentecostal experience as an example of a kind of enchanted Christianity, because they're more aware of the spirit world.
Mm-hmm.
But the more I'm learning about what the enchanted world, meaning the pre-modern world, what that experience was like, the more I realize that no, Protestantism itself is disenchantment. It is somehow separating the spiritual from the material. And if we are going to live in a world that is enchanted, by which I mean one, that is resonant, where we can sense that spiritual force is filling reality and that we have a connection with it, it is going to require somehow connecting the spirit with the material. And this became clear to me when I was reading McGhilchrist and others.
Yeah.
And I thought about this argument I had in December on the trip I took to Turkey, right?
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes.
I got into it with this American Pentecostal who was on the trip. He heard me, we're talking on the bus, he heard me say that, there's no holier place on earth for Christians than the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, because that's built over where
you said that. He didn't say that.
I said that. Yeah. I said it's built over where Golgotha and also where Christ's tomb was. The guy got all mad about it. He said, that's not true. Like, what do you mean? I said, and he said that, no, the holiest place on earth for a Christian is wherever that Christian feels closer to God. And I realized there's a chasm between me and that guy. And this is the same guy who on the same trip later pulled out his VR headset, virtual reality headset, and said, I've been going to church in the metaverse recently, and it's awesome. That's the future of Christianity. Now, why do I bring that up now? Because I think that the experience of that younger man, he was an older millennial, both his spiritual convictions and what it says about metaphysics, which is to say the relation between spirit and body, and his having been completely formed by the web, I think it is creating a generation and subsequent generations who are preparing themselves to be servile, right?
To what? Servile to what?
Servile to the machine. Servile to whoever in authority who has the resources and the power to make them feel at home in the world, feel without having to do anything more than turn on the machine.
Yeah, I think that it's difficult to disentangle modernity, right? And it's difficult to, I think that you are seeing in certain Protestant circles, especially in sort of younger generations, a return or a recognition that they need to return to some kind of liturgical reality, some kind of participatory reality, and I would say some kind of mystical reality that is, I think, perhaps somewhat ironically, but getting back to a more embodied Christianity, because I think that if I look at the developments in my own church, a lot of it was a sort of a move into abstraction in the last 50 years and
Sure.
away from this kind of embodied, in your face, sacramental, mystical experience, and a much more sort of cognitively cozy suburban type existence. But, Rod, this is sort of my point, is that we have constructed this world, the world in which you and I live in, grew up, you less so in Budapest, but, in America, it's very hard. The whole system seems to be constructed to maximize disintegration.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Well, that's just one thing, Matt, my son, is moving over here next month, and he talks, he's really interesting to talk to about this sort of thing, about the difference between America and Europe. He's thought about it more than I have. And he says that American suburbia is a disintegration machine.
Yeah.
Meant to separate us and from each other, and to make us feel fragmented and disempowered. Because if you don't have a car, you've got no power. And even if you do have a car, I can remember Matt used to say to me, "Dad, why don't you get out of the house and go do something?" And I don't want to get in a car and da 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 da. Here in Budapest, it's as easy going to meet a friend in a pub or a coffee shop is as easy as putting on my coat, walking out the front door, and walking within 10 minutes of my house. And it's not a matter of convenience, really, because when I lived in Baton Rouge, I could get to a coffee shop or a pub in 10 minutes or less in my car. But there's something indefinably pleasant and fulfilling about walking there.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I have underestimated how much my faith formation has made me basically an alien to the way we structure our living day-to-day lives in America. Like I'm, and I know I'm skipping a bunch of steps here, so I apologize to the audience, but there's something about the way in which we live our lives. I mean, like, just physically live our lives. There's a way in which, there's a way in which this has constructed me, and like it's somehow inimical. Like there's a sort of this internal dissatisfaction with cars and all of it, right? I don't.
Why is it, and this is a question Matt has put to me a lot, why is it that when we Americans go to like Disney World and go to these fake town squares, we love it. We're like, why can't things be like that? Yeah. And yet we go back to the real world that we've created for ourselves that is not like what we've just come from. It's like we think that traditional town planning, traditional urban spaces are somehow a fantasy that we can't achieve anymore, even though we're so much wealthier than we were back in the days when they created those.
Yeah, it's a mystery to me. It makes, are there some nasty forces in the background kind of making this happen? Like, I don't know, but I agree with you. It's very frustrating. You look at, anytime you see like a city or a village portrayed, like, for instance, in like a children's book or children's television program, it's like, shockingly, it's always some sort of like traditional layout with like a town square and it's like, and like, yet we all live in these sort of these, cul-de-sac after cul-de-sac after cul-de-sac of just no spaces. Right.
Yeah. When I was in Rome recently, just walking around the city, I'm like, man, the Italians in ages past knew how to build urban spaces. You'd walk down the street and you'd open up into this sort of pocket square. There would be a few coffee shops out there with tables set up, and it just was you felt so human there. Yeah. You didn't feel crushed.
Well, yeah, you didn't feel crushed or alienated, as you say. And I just keep thinking of this as kind of like embodied wisdom. You may recall, Rod, our audience may recall that I went to Oxford this past summer, and I'm actually going again this summer in July. And I immediately just felt different and better. Now, part of that, of course, is you're taking me out of my normal surroundings and the normal pulls and on the day to day that one suffers through, whatnot. That's fine. But there was just something deeply human about walking everywhere, of being in and around buildings that seemed to matter, that they weren't just sort of thrown up haphazardly. That someone, like, I remember one time I was sitting in one of the colleges and we were sitting, just in the little courtyard and just looking at the little, the little, just the wall and the foundation and the filigree and the work that they had done. And like someone, hundreds of years ago decided, like, I'm not just going to sort of stick up any old thing. I'm going to make something that will last generations beyond me.
Yeah.
Like, imagine caring that much about articulated space. Like, what a gift, number one. I mean, that is a gift from somebody who doesn't know me, generations past, in a country that is not my own. But that artisan crafted something that gave me an experience hundreds of years after the fact. So, like, that's striking to me, like that sense of time and that sense of gift, right?
You say that and you throw me back to the epiphany or the hierophany that led to me becoming a Christian. And of course, I talked about going to the cathedral at Chartres when I was 17.
Yeah.
The fact that cathedral existed, that people 900 years ago built a temple like that to the greater glory of their God, it made me realize that there is a God worth caring about.
That's right.
In other words, it told me something about the way they saw God, and it helped me, just for a glimpse, to see God as they did. And it was enough to set the hook to where eventually Christ reeled me in. But it was a building that was, to say it's a building worth caring about is to dramatically understate it. It was a phenomenal building. But it, going back to what you said, quoting Churchill, we make our buildings and our buildings make us. That building, the Chartres Cathedral, in some sense, made me. Now,
that's right.
We're running out of time, and there's a question that I don't know if I can answer. Maybe we should bring a European on to talk about it. But, this is one thing that blows me away about Europe today. You have all these beautiful churches that are empty. And I don't quite understand why, but that's, again, it's a topic for another day.
Well, maybe not. I just want to jump in real quick, and I'll try to do it in 2 minutes here. But I wonder if, your question, that you posed, would you go into the experience machine? And maybe I'm being cute here. I'm not trying to be cute. I'm not trying to be flippant, but
You're very
really,
cute,
this
Cale.
is something.
Can I say that to you? You're a cute man. You're a cute man.
Yes. Thank you. I appreciate it, Rod. But we already live in the experience machine, Rod.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the truth. And the sad part is that the experience machine that we have created is a bad experience machine.
How do you mean?
Riffing on this notion that we already participate in something that takes us out of our embodied spaces and alienates us, and has colonized us. And so I don't think it's a question of would you do it. The question really is, what will be your version of blacksmithing?
Right.
What will be your version of carving out an embodied and real existence outside of the digital irreality? I think that really has to be the point.
You're saying that brings to mind the great lesson I learned from reading the late Paul Connerton, the cultural anthropologist, and I think it was at the University of Cambridge, where he was a Marxist, but he studied the traditional societies that held onto their traditions even through the encounter with modernity. And you might remember he said those societies had several things in common. First of all, they had a sacred story they held in common. Secondly, they told that sacred story in ritual, an unvarying ritual. Third, they had a sense that the sacred story, when they told it ritually, that it somehow took them out of time, connecting them to generations past and generations in the future, and in some mystical sense to eternity. And fourth, the ritual telling of the story involved use of the body.
That's
And
right.
he had that beautiful phrase that the truths in the story become sedimented into the bones. Now, when I first read that, I
That's
was an
beautiful.
Orthodox Christian, and I said,
Hmm.
that's what we do.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
I never, as a Catholic, I had to really work hard
Yeah.
to tell myself that, wait a minute, what I'm participating in here, that is truly the
Right.
body and blood
Right.
of
Right. Right. Right.
of God
Right.
there, because there was nothing around me to
Yeah.
tell me that,
Yeah.
because we built the churches didn't feel like the kind of place you would build if you thought that was true.
Yeah,
You
no,
know?
there was clearly a move away from mystical, messy world into sort of a clear, clean world of modernity, right?
Rational and utilitarian.
Exactly. So clarity versus sort of the muckiness of
Yeah.
mystery,
Well, and
right?
interestingly enough, I've never, until now here in Budapest, I've never really been part of an Orthodox, well, actually in Dallas we had this, but most of the worship I've done as an Orthodox Christian has been in very, very modest,
Sure.
poor churches.
Yeah.
But the liturgy itself was
Mhm.
it was a cathedral
Yeah. Yeah.
of just such a beautiful and rich, involved thing. And as an Orthodox Christian, you are always making the Matanya, the bow,
Mhm.
sometimes a prostration and all
Mhm.
that. So that's it's amazing. We have young people who would come to our parish when I was living in Baton Rouge, and you'd say most of them are evangelicals, but some Catholics wanted to be Orthodox. And you'd ask them, glad to see you. Why are you
Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
because it's real.
Right.
And you try to dig in to say, what do you mean by it's real? And they really couldn't articulate it, but they felt it. I know what they were feeling.
Yeah.
That they feel like there's something about the ritual that we engage in week in and week out that makes the truths of the faith of following Jesus more real than what we were part of before. And
Mhm.
I hate that we're out of time, because I was just thinking, I have a friend at my church in Baton Rouge. He's an architect, commercial architect. And I remember him telling me that he would
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
to build beautiful buildings,
Yeah.
but he said nobody wants them. Nobody wants to pay for them.
Yeah.
He said that, businesses want to put up something as cheaply as they can, with the idea that, when we have used it up, we'll just tear it down and build something new. But this is, to go back to Hartmut Rosa, this is why we live in disenchanted landscapes, because we think of the world around us, that when we create buildings, they're not for eternity. They're not
Right.
even for 10 years from now.
Right.
They're for what we can use them for right now. So we create a landscape that is not worth caring about. Behind me, I live in Budapest on the Buda side, near the Buda Hill. That's where some of the worst fighting of World War II happened. Only Stalingrad was more vicious in terms of urban fighting. And they're just now, like in the last few years, getting around to rebuilding some of the old buildings that were there. Well, guess what? They're rebuilding them in the old way.
Wow.
That would not have happened before. If they had
That's
the
right.
money to do this in the 70s or the 80s, they would have put ugly
Awful.
glass towers.
Okay. Yeah. So this gets me back. I want to make a connection here in this last thing, you talk about with Paul Connerton. How about this for some kind of inversion, right? That in Connerton's construction, we have these sacred stories that form us, right? What if the sacred story is actually profane? Right? What if the holy story that binds us together as a people has been inverted, and so that story becomes a kind of an abstracted, profane one in which we preach not belonging but separation. We preach not unity but some kind of single autonomous, disparate breaking up. Right? I mean, there's the so that we do have a script still. We do have a story, but the story itself has become kind of our undoing. It has become the source for our discontent, and we can't quite see it as
The
such.
cultural liturgy by
Yeah.
which we live is designed to disenchant,
Right.
to
Right.
fragment.
That's right. That's right.
To instead of being symbolic of bringing together, it's diabolic
That's
for
right.
tearing
That's right.
apart.
That's right.
You ought to write a book, bro.
Yeah. Well, I think that's your book. All right. Well, look, Rod, this is our time. We have exceeded by a couple of minutes. Hopefully our audience will not mind. But as always, you can find Rod's stuff at the American Conservative under his blog there. He has a Substack. You had a great Substack today, by the way, about the saints, the powerful story of holy men in contemporary times. Anyway, check out Rod at www.roddreer.substack.com. Also on Twitter, Rod's there too, at Rod Dreer. I have a Substack, kalezeldin.substack.com. I am also on Twitter, and always hit the like and subscribe button. We do appreciate that. And Rod, on that note, why don't you send us out?
Kale, you told me before we started that people have been asking you, why doesn't Rod do the old-fashioned what Uncle Bubba back in St. Francisville did?
That's right.
And so I think maybe we should bring it back. So here we go. Don't get nothing on you.
All right, man. Take care. All right, bye-bye.